Hi, I'm Nichole Argo, the director of the TogetherUp Institute, and you are listening to Reimagining Us.
And I'm Scott Hutcheson, executive director of E Pluribus Unum. All right, Nichole, new episode, new ideas, new discussion. What are we doing today?
So today we are unpacking this idea of us versus them dynamics and how they've seeped into even our daily lives as part of toxic polarization and the divisions that we see around us.
Do you think they seeped in or isn't that our natural go-to sometimes of when you enter a room, it's like, and us, them, it's so baked in. I've heard it forever.
I think baked in as part of a culture where people perceive themselves to be under threat, but not baked in. If you think about all the rooms in your life that you've walked into where you felt welcomed or where you trusted others and knew what to expect, right? Even most of my life, I feel like public life, political life was civil, was seeing itself as a bigger community and part of a process of governance and decision-making. But I think today, given the binary talking points of our pundits and political leaders and the other side is a threat to us and this sense that we don't want the same things, we don't know each other, we're not alike, all those pieces of toxic polarization have really led us to constantly be vigilant, that there is an us, that there is a them, and it's that simple, right? And that's what we have to break out of.
See, I love that because it gives me hope. And I love that the way this episode and really this whole podcast is organized is that what we think, something that I thought, as a kid all the way up, is the us and them, that you have to manage that. And what you're saying is that we can actually overcome that in a way that keeps us divided and respect each other, find new ways to connect, and listen and be curious. I'm excited. So who's joining us today?
Today we'll have Peter Coleman and Stephen Hawkins. Dr. Coleman is a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at the Teachers College and the Earth Institute. He directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution and is the founding director of the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice. He is a co-executive director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, and the author of The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, amongst many other publications. Peter is a renowned expert on constructive conflict resolution and sustainable peace. Dr. Coleman, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Reimagining Us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
We're glad to have you today.
So let's jump right in. You start your book with an incredible metaphor, and I'm wondering if you would read it for us. It's about a Cherokee elder speaking to a youth. Would you be willing to read it?
Sure, happy to. So it's an old tale about a Cherokee elder who's teaching his grandchild about life and says, a fight is going on inside you. It's a terrible fight between two wolves. One wolf represents fear, anger, envy, greed, arrogance, and ego. And the other stands for joy, peace, love, hope, kindness, generosity, and faith. And the same fight going on inside you is inside every other person. So the child thought about it for a moment and then asked, well, which wolf will win? And the old man replied, the one you feed.
I find
Great.
that it's very profound. You go on to say that the first wolf has a commanding lead in this contest today, especially in this country, and it set you on a journey to really understand everything science knew about polarization. And then in your first chapter, you talk about 3 stories that emerged, sort of different levels of analysis. And I'm wondering, can you explain for our listeners, what those 3 stories are about?
Yeah, what I was trying to do is, there's so much research on intergroup conflict and intergroup contact theory of what helps, what the problems are, what helps. And so when I wrote the book, The Way Out, I did a sort of deep search on particularly the more robust scientific literature on this. And it's fast. There's so much research on intergroup relations, intergroup conflict. But I wanted to sort of summarize it as I can. And so I categorized it basically into those things that affect us as humans, as individuals, those things that affect groups or sort of tribalism or nationalism, and those things that affect the larger society. And essentially to try to tell a story that, basically there's no one thing that's driving Americans apart and pitting us against each other these days. It's a constellation of many things, but we can think about them in terms of our own sensitivities or vulnerabilities to being divided. We as humans are susceptible to political messages or to Instagram posts that irritate us or outrage us. We can get easily triggered. We can, particularly if it attacks a member of one of our groups, our gender, race, religion, religious groups, we are susceptible to these things. And so there are certain individual characteristics that psychology and even neuroscience has taught us that make us as individuals more susceptible to threat from other groups, or at least the perception of threat, or to messages of that kind. And then that's situated in our groups, the sort of tribalism, the need to belong. I think particularly today, so many people are feeling across the world, because of our times, are feeling sort of isolated, insulated, unconnected to important people, losing relationships. And that sort of agony of loneliness makes us vulnerable to wanting to belong to groups, and then seeing particular groups, political groups, or political leaders that are talking about us as a group are very attractive, right? So there are things about tribalism itself and our groups themselves, and the need under times of duress or threat for us to sort of circle the wagons and support each other and be very careful about what we say to each other, and to vilify outgroups, right? So those dynamics in psychology and in social psychology, sociology, there's tons of research that talks about how those things can feed each other. And then they're at a societal level. There's a recent poll that was put out by the Edelman Trust about polarization around the world. And they categorize a variety of nations in terms of their degree of polarization today. I think the most polarized is Argentina and Colombia, the country. And America is number 3, right? So, and in fact, many democracies are high in what they call severe levels of political polarization. So at a societal, even global level, the conditions are ripe where democracies tend to be more susceptible to division. It's our very openness, the openness of our media, of our social media, that allows it to be weaponized, right? And so creates the conditions where this kind of polarization can occur. So basically those 3 things are nested. Our inclinations and tendencies are nested in our groups that we really value and cherish and want to belong to, and manage our reputations in. And that's nested in societies where we have a lot of anxiety around so much information coming at us, so much vitriol and politics, AI taking over our lives. We're very anxious societies, these Western societies, and it does feel oftentimes there's a lack of sense of control.
So Peter, is before I get into the other question, just to respond to that. So,
Yeah.
I agree that, political polarization and then the idea of our 2-party system or 3-party system, however people look at it, that is what makes democracy, and your ability to speak out and to protest and all of those other things. And I think there's oftentimes a blurring of those lines where, toxic polarization, as you said, can influence political, but also political, relentless misinformation of political parties or something like that leads to the toxic part too. Is that correct? I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, we right now are at a historically high level of political enmity, where our level of hate for them, for Republicans, level of hate for Democrats, and vice versa. And the dysfunction we see in Washington and at the state level capitals is at an all-time high. So this is it's a qualitatively different thing. And yes, the influence goes in both directions. I do want to call out, though, that it is leaders, political leaders and others that have influence, right, in our society, cultural leaders and political leaders. And it's when they turn on each other, when they use vitriol and hate as the primary way of communication, it normalizes it for the population. And that's when we see spikes in hate crimes, spikes in violence, because we see basically the adults doing it on media, and we think, oh, I guess it's okay, right? It's only when those leaders stop that and call it out and sort of start to say this is not acceptable behavior that you see a decrease in that. So there is a proportionate level of responsibility for those in power to not vilify and hate publicly, to not turn to those tools so easily and so readily.
Tell us a little bit more about our physiological responses to conflict, to threat and trauma. What's happening in our brain, in our body, when we have a threatening conversation?
I mean, if you think about sports, right? Sports is a competition. It's a very intense competition if you're watching the US Open or football or whatever, but it's always a place where you have rules and referees, and they create a safe enough space, right? Sometimes it's not safe enough, but a safe space where you can differ, you can compete, you can contest each other, but there are rules and there are referees that enforce those rules. And I think that's a really important component to intense competition. When politics becomes pure win-lose competition, then we really do see the other as a threat, or when they either are a threat or are portrayed as a threat to, democracy, to the end of the world, And when that starts to happen, we really start to see them and become triggered by them. So what happens to us sort of neurologically in our brain is that when we perceive threat, it triggers the amygdala, which is the kind of emotion center, the fear center in our brain. And so even neuroscientists that study conflict and brain science see that if you present a picture of an out group to someone, there is automatically stimulation of the amygdala of your brain, of your threat center. And so even though there's no other context for this, it's just someone that I consider an out group, you sense that. However, you can quickly override that. You can quickly say, this person is actually a member of this group, which you're a member of, and this group that you're a member of, and this group, and then it dissipates, right? But there is a very primitive part of us that is hypersensitive to threat. It's an evolutionary mechanism that keeps us, safe under some conditions and is dysfunctional under other conditions. But that's a primary thing, and I do want to stress that experience of sort of threat and a need to retaliate against threat is a phenomenon that many social media platforms, the major social media platforms and mainstream media and politicians are aware of. They know the science behind this. And it is the coin of the realm, right? It's how they keep you addicted to Instagram or to Facebook, how they keep you addicted to their news source, or how they generate your adoration as a politician. It's through that outrage. There is research on this that when you feel outrage and a need, taste for retaliation, it triggers the same parts of the brain that are triggered by narcotics. So it is an addictive substance. They know it. They play on it. And that's part of this multi-level problem that we're in, is that there's whole businesses and industries that are playing on our sensitivity to threat and our addiction to outrage, right? So yeah, these are basic neurological mechanisms that we use to survive, but when we're in a context that's constantly triggering them, they become toxic, they become overwhelming, they become addictive.
And I so appreciate that, and I hope people hear exactly what you just said as clearly as you just said it, because one of the goals of this podcast is we want people to understand how our bodies react, but also to your point you just made, that there are people who know how to manipulate that. There are people who know how to send that trigger to get you to do a predictable thing or lead you toward a predictable thing. And there are ways to counter that.
And for a lot of listeners on this program, we are trying to gear thinking towards what about us, right? What can we do? And we're going about that in a couple ways. Some of it is frames, new frames for thinking about what we see around us. Some of it is mindsets and skill sets, tools for changing patterns in our own lives and our communities. So you yourself have spent a great deal of time, both in your book, in your collaboration with Starts With Us, advancing a set of tools that individuals and groups can use as a way out of these sorts of patterns. Would you walk us through them?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the story behind this, and again, it's similar to, I think, your MO for this podcast, is that, I wrote the book The Way Out, published it in 2021, spent a couple of years working on it because I felt like everyday people could benefit from understanding the science, right? There's I think sometimes a misunderstanding of the science around contact theory and getting together. And so I wanted to be clear about when it helps, when it doesn't, and under what conditions does it help, right? So I write this book. About a year after I write the book, I realized, nobody's reading books anymore. It's very few people will sit down, crack an entire book and read it. And so I wanted to figure out ways to disseminate the ideas, to get the activities, the actions, the steps out to people that were sticky, more compelling. So we put a group of people together, students and my daughter and some other folks, and spent some time creating what we called a challenge. There are 5 chapters in the book that are scientific principles that affect me as an individual, affect my relationships, affect my community. It can affect my choices at different levels. And so we kind of spell out those 5 principles. The first is simply, when you understand yourself to be in one of these kinds of intractable problems, and it might be just a relationship where you feel very estranged from them, but you don't want to be, the first thing you may want to do is just reset, just stop, just pause. Don't run into a conversation with them in the typical way that's going to escalate. Take some time to do that. And then the second basic principle is to is to look for what's working. So one of the things I started to ask myself is, well, what are the conditions under which I'm my better self? Or who do I know actually that's really good at this? And what do they do? I think of Jean-Paul Lederach or Andrea Bartoli or my oldest brother. There's certain people that I think of in difficult times, and how do they do this? How do they show up? The third thing is complicate. And again, sometimes asking questions like that, like, who are you, gives you information about the other person, their life, their circumstances that you had no idea. So complicating is the third principle. The fourth is movement. And this is a physiological thing. This is, as a peacemaker and a mediator, what we tend to do is oftentimes just bring disputants together, have them sit down and talk to each other and try to talk out problems. Most of the time that goes really well. But when our differences have really settled into our neurological structures, so we can no longer really hear their arguments, we only listen to half of what they say, which, confirms our beliefs and values. When it really becomes very difficult to have those conversations, what research is telling us, particularly neuroscience research, is that movement helps. Us moving by ourselves, or more importantly, moving physically side by side outside with someone who opposes you. And this is what neuroscience finds. They study, dance troops and combat troops that march together, and marching bands and groups that move in sync. And what they find is that when people do that, it connects us. It not only loosens us up because we're physically active, but in terms of our attitudes and our actions, but it also connects us and connects a sense of compassion. So movement is a powerful thing. And then the final component of this is to what we say adapt, which is to recognize that cloud problems are not things that you are amenable to quick fixes. They take time.
What strikes me super fast here is that every one of these is relational. Even what you started with spot and reset, right? That
Yeah,
it's my
yeah.
relationship with myself and my intentions. And then seeing someone as a complicated person is humanizing them. All these
Yeah.
different values and stories. And movement, which is a common activity, a productive project you do together. And
Yeah.
like you said, it's a fusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So my question to you is there some systems level response that we also need to do this? Is it enough for us as individuals in our communities? Are there things that our communities, our municipalities, or other institutions can do to help us? Or
Yeah.
what else do we need to make this successful in your view?
So I guess that's my message to you, is that in all of these sectors, there's tremendous and bridge building work at the community level, right? If you go to the Bridging Divides Initiative, which is a website comes out of Princeton, there's a map of the U.S. and it shows you the 8,000 community-based organizations that have sprung up that do bridge building work locally, right? And so you can toggle into your community and see where the half dozen groups are in your town. So they're at the lower levels of communities, and then they're in these sectors of government and business and education and elsewhere. It is a movement. That's what's promising, and that's it's going to take, right? Because there's no magic bullets here. There's no quick fixes here. It's going to take a community of people like this, even if it's uncoordinated, right? To be able to ultimately give us the kind of cultural shift that many of us are seeking.
Well, Peter, this has been a remarkable conversation, and one that I know will continue. It's always enlightening to learn about the work, to learn about the responses, what our brains do when we're in these situations. And so I think there's a lot to noodle on here, but also a lot of options for people to take you up on. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you for having me.
Today.
It's a pleasure to talk. Thank you for the work you do. And let's keep the conversations going.
We are all in for that. Much gratitude, Peter. Thank you so much, and keep up the good work.
Okay, Nichole, tell me about Steve Hawkins.
So Stephen has served as the Director of Research at More in Common since it was founded in 2016, overseeing studies on the psychology of political division across 9 countries in the world. Prior to joining More in Common, he conducted public opinion research for Fortune 100 companies, United Nations agencies, electoral campaigns, and political movements. Stephen speaks frequently at national and international conferences, has taken caller questions on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and appears regularly on Colorado Matters to discuss politics and polarization.
Welcome. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so More in Common has done some foundational, field-advancing research to understand polarization and how to counter it in the United States. So we want to talk to you depthfully about 3 different studies that your team has done. And all of them really speak to this question: how do we get out of the polarized mess we're in? How do we find our commonalities and move forward with them? So let's start with the first, which was called Hidden Tribes, because it revealed a stunning fact, and maybe one that we would never imagine scrolling through our social media feeds or switching on cable TV. In some ways, it's very hopeful. Can you explain what the exhausted majority is in the United States?
Yes, the exhausted majority by far is the concept that More in Common is most known for in the United States. And it refers to a 2/3 share of the American public that we interpret as being neither fully aligned with the left nor fully aligned with the right, but instead feeling a little bit more ideologically flexible, who are feeling fed up with political division, who don't see themselves as well reflected in the ideological and hyper-polarized debate, and who are more open to finding points of compromise on the big issues of our time. And I think that the point here that's really helpful for people is they see the cacophony and they see the animosity of our politics. And a lot of Americans are just not as fully invested in that conflict. And they don't see themselves just as either Team Red or Team Blue. And they're They don't want to engage in politics, especially when it's, being marshaled in this way, being advanced in this way. And the exhausted majority just put its finger on that sentiment. And so we have, when we released that study in 2018, we must have done 24 interviews with press who almost to a person said, I'm in the exhausted majority. I am a part of the exhausted majority. People are eager to self-identify with that group. And there's something comforting in acknowledging that this feeling of fatigue is not uncommon, that you're not alone in feeling that fatigue. In fact, that you're with the majority of Americans when you feel that way. And I could say a lot more about it, but that's the main idea.
I know a million people who would describe themselves that way, and it's. But what's interesting about it is like exhaustion. Nobody wants to be exhausted, but I know that there are a lot of implications that you learn from the study. So, like, what are the positive implications of the exhausted majority? What are the negative ones?
Well, the positive ones is that it creates some opportunity. When we see the world in a binary lens, then we just see it in this oppositional way. But when the exhausted majority is not a monolithic group at all. So we describe 4 groups as belonging to it: traditional liberals, passive liberals, politically disengaged, and moderates. Now, those people are very diverse in how they engage politically. Some of them vote Democrat, some of them vote Republican, some of them don't vote at all. Like, politically disengaged have very low rates of voter participation. And so when you see that there's this amorphous group, it's not a demographically coherent group, it's not a politically coherent group, but it is something which tethers people together, which is this sentiment that we can do better than this, we can have better discourse than this, we can form new coalitions that aren't just affiliated with these binary labels. That's the good news, is that the exhaustion is actually a unifying force, or has the potential to be. The bad news is that our political structures are actually pretty rigid, and they don't allow in this country for those sorts of coalitions to form into practical political teams. More in Common is an international organization, and we work in Poland and France and Germany and the UK and Spain and Brazil as well. And in some of these other countries, most recently just in France, new political coalitions just pop up when they see, for instance, that there's a resurgent far right that poses a threat to the stability of the country, to its commitment to civil society, its commitment, to immigration and to pluralism. Then you can get these awkward bedfellows to join together and say, we're actually going to form a common entity here, and we're going to allow the public, with just a few weeks' notice, to reconsider how they vote on the basis of these new teams. And we don't do this in the United States. Our first past the post voting system, our two-party system, is pretty calcified into the fabric of our politics and into our culture. And also our affiliation with these parties is a little bit stronger than we see in other countries, where parties kind of come and go with more frequency than they do in the United States. So that's the bad news, is that at this cultural level, at the everyday life level of Americans listening to the news, on social media, driving in their cars in their commute, being at work, being at school, Americans are part of this exhausted majority. But when it comes to the actual moment of voting and creating the coalitions of power that determine the legislation in our country, the exhausted majority has not been able to find its voice.
So I want to open up another line of research that More in Common has worked on, and this relates to the perception gap.
Yeah.
What is the perception gap in the United States, and how do you see it playing out on different issues? What does it mean for us?
Yeah. So perception gaps are places where our understanding of how our political opponents, the other side, think versus the reality of how those people think. And in the political science literature, this is referred to as false polarization. It's not saying that there aren't differences. There are meaningful differences, both in the sort of demographic composition of Republicans versus Democrats and attitudinal differences between Republicans and Democrats, meaning we don't look the same and we don't think the same. But those differences are often vastly exaggerated in the way that we perceive the other side. And so what the perception gap is we just ask people, what percent of Democrats do you think support open borders? What percent of Republicans do you think support basic gun control? And we found that people were really bad at making these estimates. And the interesting thing about it was that it's not the case that the people who read the Wall Street Journal or read the New York Times and who are listening to political podcasts and who are voting are actually better informed about their political opponents. It's actually the reverse. This is one of the most interesting and counterintuitive things that we have found, is that being politically engaged actually, it distorts your ability to stay grounded with what is average and what is normal, because the news feed, our social media feeds, they're selectively finding those nuggets, those moments, those clips, those tweets that are the most incendiary, and you're seeing them all the time. But they're actually not happening all the time. They are just being pulled out from a universe of a much more normal population that's saying much more ordinary things, and you're having your attention drawn to them. And so we actually found this reverse relationship where the people who were the least politically engaged had the best instincts about what the people on the other political side thought, because they're not inundated by the extreme and ideological social media feeds. And so it's really striking. And the other thing we found, this is not necessarily good news for everybody, but we found that the more educated Democrats became, the less likely they were to have Republican friends. And we found that correlated again with higher perception gaps. And so this is not good news for the elite, because it shows that the more politically engaged and the more educated you are, the more you're at risk of these distorting effects where you sort of hyperbolize and exaggerate your understanding of what the average member of the other side thinks. Let me give an example. Republicans overwhelmingly think that Democrats don't want to teach that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are founding documents that we should be proud of. They think that only maybe a third or so of Democrats believe that, and overwhelmingly they don't. In fact, it's the opposite. Overwhelmingly, Democrats do think that we should be teaching about our founding in that way. Democrats think Republicans don't want to teach about the history of slavery or segregation, that they don't want to teach about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, for instance. And overwhelmingly, 93%, for instance, of Republicans do. And so we're seeing that people aren't just getting it wrong by a degree. Well, it's 5 out of 10. Actually, no, it's 6 out of 10. They're getting the majority position wrong. They're saying a majority of Republicans don't want to teach MLK, when in fact, overwhelmingly 9 out of 10 Republicans do want to teach MLK.
What have you seen that individuals can do? I mean, to the people listening, what could they do to be aware of and, bridge the perception gap?
One thing that I try to do is have referred to as a balanced media diet. Now, a balanced diet in real life with food isn't something that's that appealing. It's much more attractive to just go eat the stuff that you most like. And that's it's a good metaphor for what our information systems in general are now, whether it's social media or cable news. Well, what do you want to hear? You want to hear that your team is doing things right, the other side is crazy and dangerous. And that's a lot of what's happening in our information systems. And what can happen is that you have an unhealthy brain, an unhealthy mind, an unhealthy perception of our politics if you're only consuming that which confirms your prior positions. And so while it's not maybe comfortable to always listen to other perspectives from other news sources that conflict with yours, it does have this beneficial effect, which is that you can empathize more with the other side and see the critiques of your own side that maybe you don't otherwise hear. And so I try to do this. I'll listen to podcasts from people who I often disagree with, but I always end up learning things, because a lot of times it's not the case that one side is just lying and the other side is making up facts. It's just often the case that people are picking the parts of the news cycle that are interesting and validating for their own team, and just omitting the stories that don't resonate with their audience. And so it's not necessarily that there's this dishonesty by explicit lies. It's just maybe a little bit of omission that's happening. And so if you can balance your media diet by listening to news sources or podcasts, following people on social media that bring up those other stories, then you can find yourself a little bit more oriented towards how the other side thinks, and be a little bit less manipulated, frankly, which I think is a good way to think about it, is be less manipulated into the conflict that defines our politics now.
I know there's a lot of work showing that once people realize that their understandings of the extreme positions of the other side are not necessarily true, it has a huge impact on them, on their belief of how we can move forward, that we have common ground. But I guess I'm going to say, have you seen that in your work? And then also more globally, with all the work you've described, what impact have you seen your findings hold for individuals who learn some of this, or for organizations, or stories of change?
The big picture here is that since about the 1980s, since the Reagan era, we've just seen affective polarization rise and rise. It used to be about 40 years ago that Americans just felt basically neutral towards the other side. It was a little bit less than neutral. They'd say about 45 or so on a 100-point scale. It's like, I don't particularly like you or dislike you. You're just, not like me. And we've seen that number just drop and drop, so that now people are scoring in the low 20s in the studies that we've done. So we're seeing it's active animosity. And so the question is, how can we increase that warmth so that people feel not necessarily a deep bond and connection to people from the other side, but they don't see them as this existential threat, which today both parties describe the other as posing an existential threat. And so with this perception gap findings, what we have tried to measure is, and what we have measured with the randomized control trial, is what effect does it have when you can correct these perceptions. But here's what we learned that's, I think, really encouraging, and as a takeaway for your audience and for each of us. When we just share the information that people have distorted understandings about the other side, we just say, hey, you think it's 40%, it's actually 70%. It doesn't have nearly the same effect as when that information is shared by somebody who you relate to politically. And so if we as a society want to correct our misperceptions, we need to enlist members of our own team to be the communicators, and we need ourselves to be the communicators. I learned this about people from the other side, and it really struck me. And so I think we have to layer these complexities onto the problem. Part of it is just correcting the misperception. But before you can even do that, you need to establish a relationship of trust, because we have a society that's also suffering heavily from an absence of trust in our information systems, in our government, in our institutions generally, and in each other. Our social trust levels are really low too. So it's only through relationships that we can have the real power of these sorts of interventions. We need to have those in-group validators, what we call in the science, people who look like me in more common terms. They need to be involved here.
We've covered a lot of material, and I don't feel overwhelmed. I feel pretty hopeful.
Yeah, there's a lot of hope in there. I mean, like we talked about, data, when you know it, it can be hopeful. You can do something with it. It makes a difference.
Thank you for helping us find some pieces to amplify for others here in the United States who, maybe like us, are looking for a new way.
Of course. Thank you, Nichole. Thank you, Scott. Really enjoyed the conversation today.
That is a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time on Reimagining Us.